listened to a podcast today, the psychology podcast, and had a woman named Kristin Neff on, who I believe is a researcher, and her focus was around self-compassion and just a lot of just interesting views and research that's been done on that. So interesting podcast. It was about 35 minutes. I'd recommend it if you're interested in the topic. But what I wanted to hone in on is, as I often do when I listen to podcasts or things that put forth kind of theories or frameworks or things to consider. And her point mainly was that self-compassion is like an unbelievably valuable tool. And she had a lot of good research that supported that and some experiments that have been done and lots of analysis. And it kind of showed a correlation between self-compassion and a number of other positive attributes that benefit people and allow them to succeed and increases their motivation and their empathy and all sorts of things. So really interesting. So whenever I hear that, I want to understand it, again, at kind of a first principles base level. How does that actually work? What's the mechanics? And the lens I usually run it through, which I should say, I am certainly open to adjusting or changing the lens that I run it through. It's the one that seems to fit the best right now. It doesn't mean it's right, but it fits the best. Is this pleasure versus discomfort kind of constant analysis that we're running, particularly our subconscious, and trying to maximize for pleasure versus discomfort. So when she was talking about self-compassion, what people often think about when they hear that, and she addressed this pretty well in the podcast, is they think it makes you kind of soft. It allows you to make excuses for yourself if you do the wrong thing, if you make a bad decision, if you don't live up to your potential, if you make a mistake, whatever it is. Self-compassion means you kind of forgive yourself for it, and you treat yourself well, and you're not too hard on yourself. And there's truth to that's what it is. But what she made the point of saying a number of times is that it has to be real self-compassion. And it made me think about gratitude as I talk about it, that it has to be genuine gratitude. For it to be impactful, for it to make a difference, it has to be genuine. And it seems like it's the same with this self-compassion. But in this case, genuine doesn't necessarily just mean that you believe it. And this is the part that I thought was really interesting and kind of, it was only a 35-minute conversation, but I'd be curious and kind of building on it and hearing more about this. When it comes to self-compassion, what it means to be genuine is that it's objective, that it's deserved, right, to an extent. So if you make a mistake, to be compassionate with yourself doesn't mean to just forgive yourself and excuse everything and say, well, I shouldn't be so hard on myself, I should be nicer to myself. A lot of people may take it that way. And in many ways, that kind of becomes a cognitive out in my terms. It's a way to forgive yourself, to not actually have to do the work, to not have to get better, to not have to fix it. But what was really good when this woman was explaining it is that she was explaining it as you have to be honest with yourself. You have to be objective. She spoke about it a lot in terms of mindfulness, but in being aware of yourself and who you are, which if there was one issue I take with the podcast and the message is that part was glossed over a little bit. I mean, they certainly addressed it, and perhaps it's just for me. Maybe there's a lot of people out there that find that a very easy step. But from where I sit, that step of really knowing yourself and really being able to be honest with yourself and face inconvenient truths, that's perhaps the hardest step of all. That's the part that's key to this whole thing, and that's the part that our subconscious, our minds are programmed in such a way to protect us from. We don't want to face those inconvenient truths. So if being compassionate effectively with yourself to get all those benefits she's speaking of, there's a prerequisite step that says you can be totally honest and objective with yourself. There's a gap there. I think a lot of people have to fill, myself included still to some extent. But if you could do it, right? When you make that mistake, when you make that bad decision, when you do something that you wish you had done differently, whatever it is, being compassionate with yourself, it's as it always does. It means just finding the balance, finding the truth, finding the objective truth, which is what we're always seeking for. And what happens, I think, too often is there's a population of people that beat themselves up about it, right? You make a mistake, you do something wrong, what have you, and you go right to a place of like, oh, I'm just an idiot, I'm the worst, I always screw this up, I'm never going to get it right. You can think of all the things that you start telling yourself. Self-compassion doesn't mean going from one extreme all the way to the other, which is such a common mistake we make, is we get afraid of one extreme. I don't want to be too hard on myself, so I'll just jump to the other extreme and be super easy on myself. That can't be the answer either. It's got to be bringing it back to the middle and bringing it back to balance. How can I be objective about this? What do I deserve to beat myself up about a little bit? What's the stuff that I should have gotten right, that I should have known better, or that I just allowed myself to run some bad math on, right? That stuff is deserving to be reflective and hard on myself about. But what's the stuff? It's just common mistakes, things we all do. Nobody's perfect. Something I couldn't have known. I had to go through that experience to learn it. Let's be honest about that. And really, I think at the heart of compassion is the understanding of what went wrong. We talk about this all the time. We do what we want to do. There is a calculation being run for every decision we make, and we act in accordance with it. In those terms, at a very first principles level, compassion to me just means understanding that calculation, understanding how you got to that point in that decision and accepting it and saying, in that moment that felt right, but now I can see that it wasn't, and now I can improve, now I can evolve and move forward. To me, that's the unbelievable power of compassion. It gives you that objective truth to see what actually led to my decision so that I can actually fix it.